Okay guys, in this short video, we're going to be looking at some invasive species of Australia. We're going to be looking at what are some of the major invasive species that Australia is dealing with, how do they get there, where is their range or where are they found, and what are some solutions that the Australian government is, the solutions that they're using to solve these problems. Alright. First off, just a quick reminder, invasive species are non-native plants or animals that invade an ecosystem. And like I mentioned before, invasive species are a man-made problem. So, unfortunately, humans, man, woman, child, they have taken things, in this case animals, that are not naturally found in this environment, and they've released them or they've escaped, and they've now caused problems for the native population. Unfortunately, Australia has had 19 small species go extinct due to the invasive species. And that number, unfortunately, is believed to increase as the years go on. Now, some of the invasive species that we're going to look at today include the feral cat, the feral pig, the brumby, the fox, the dingo, the camel, and the rabbit. And Australia has many more. This doesn't include the list of invasive plants either. But here are a few things. Here's a dingo, which we'll talk about. Here's a brumby. And then here's a camel, which we've all seen at some point or another. Alright, so a lot of people are wondering, what's the big deal? They're just animals, let them be. And why is it so hard for Australia to control these animals? Now, a major reason why these animals are so hard to deal with has to do with the size of Australia. Because Australia is so big, it makes it hard to police or monitor the numbers of these animals. And due to the majority of Australians living on the coast, it makes it harder to manage. So, because most people live in this area that I'm kind of tracing, it makes it hard for them to kind of manage or control this entire area. Keep in mind, Australia, not only is it a country, but it's an entire continent. So it makes it very difficult for them, and it can also be very expensive. Alright, the first animal we're going to be talking about is the feral cat. Now, looking at this picture down below, you're probably you're thinking to yourself, oh, that looks like just like any regular house cat. And to an extent, they used to be. Now, feral cats or wild cats have caused the extinction of many of Australia's native birds. Unfortunately, the way that works is cats are essentially predatory by nature. You keep in mind, you let a cat out of the house, and their hunting instinct is super strong still. The way I always envision it, just imagine if your little house cat was over 60 pounds or bigger. It'd almost be like a little mini mountain lion running around your property. And they're pretty strong for their size. Now, how did they arrive in Australia? Well, they originally came to Australia as pets, but either they were released, people were they abandoned them, they didn't need them anymore, didn't want them, let them go, or they simply escaped. And over the years, they ended up becoming wilder and wilder, and thus now becoming a major problem. In Australia, it is extremely hard to catch these animals just because they're super quick. They can fit in places that humans can't fit, so it makes it very hard to eliminate these animals. Now, they do have a couple solutions that the government has tried to varying levels of success. One is unfortunately to hunt them. If you're a cat person, obviously the last thing you want to hear is how cats are being hunted. However, in Australia, you can actually hunt them if you can prove that they are harming your property, or if they're seen as a threat to the native species. Another more humane way of not killing them has been to sterilize. And what that means is essentially they'll trap them, they'll catch them, and then they'll take them to a vet, and then they will give them an operation where they remove their reproductive organs, not being able to have any more kittens. And that's more or less what they've been able to do so far. The next animal is the feral pig. Now, feral pigs were first introduced to Australia in the 1700s. Originally, they were brought to Australia to be hunted. However, after they were released and without Australia having a lot of major predators, their population exploded and it spread across the entire continent. Unfortunately, some of you know this, but most people don't realize, is that feral pigs or wild pigs, they can develop what are known as tusks, kind of like in this picture down below, and they are super sharp. So, the reason why they are considered an invasive species or considered a pest is because they can destroy almost anything. These pigs can get very large. They can destroy crops, roots, soil in order for them to get to the thing that they want to eat. And they will tear up land and the crops to get their food. And another thing that makes it hard, as I've very briefly mentioned, because they can reproduce so quickly, it makes it harder to maintain their numbers. As you can see here in this map, this is kind of a map that I found on the internet showing where a lot of their numbers are concentrated. Yellow, obviously pretty high. Red means that they're high numbers of them. Their solution is essentially just to hunt them. And Australia is not the only country that is dealing with feral pigs. The United States, especially in the South, has a lot of trouble with these. It's very common for people to actually go hunting for feral pigs. I've seen people or videos where people will hunt them out of a helicopter because they're trying to kill as many of these pigs as quickly as possible. The next animal you probably wouldn't consider an invasive species, but that is the Brumby, aka the wild horse. So Brumbies or the Brumby are wild horses that are descendants of horses that arrived with the early Europeans. So when the explorers were on these boats, they brought horses with them. Obviously, being on a boat for months on end was not very good for the horses, so a lot of them died out. But the ones that survived this trip were typically the much bigger and the stronger ones. So they already had a very good background. Now, these wild horses were either released into the wild or they escaped. Once they escaped, they obviously reproduced with the other wild horses. Now, the reason why they are considered an invasive species, they are extremely destructive towards the native plants and crops. They will obviously trample on crops and grasses, or they're eating all the grasses before other native animals can eat it. And unfortunately, due to Australia not having very large predators or a natural predator, their numbers are also difficult to manage. So here's just a picture of a European with their horses back in the day. And here are some examples of Brumbies or wild horses out in the wild. They look just like regular horses, but their manes are much, much longer and so forth. Now, some solutions that I've come across have been trapping them and then sterilizing them to ensure that they can't reproduce. So just like with the feral cat, they'll trap them, they'll take them to a vet, and then they will remove their ability to reproduce. Looking at this, and down below here is a map of kind of the areas where these feral horses or Brumbies are distributed throughout Australia. As you can see, they're pretty spread out. Everything in green is approximately where their numbers are. All right, our next one, we have the fox. Now, this animal was introduced to Australia in about 1855, and it was brought for recreational hunting. So as the Europeans arrived in Australia, they started to miss the things that they did back home. One of those was hunting foxes. So they thought, hey, I'm going to bring some foxes, release them into the wild. Shortly after arriving in Australia, these animals ended up being a major threat to small birds and mammals, and they were immediately threatened. Unfortunately, this also is a threat to farms and ranches, which is why they're considered a pest, because they'll steal chickens, ducks, small mammals, and things like that. So, in Australia, their solution for the fox is essentially to either poison them, which is kind of hit or miss because other animals can be exposed to that poison, or the other option is to hunt them. The next one looks like a regular house dog, but it is known as a dingo, or we're just going to call these the dingoes. Now, this is kind of a strange animal because it is both a native and an invasive species of Australia. So let me kind of explain. So dingoes have lived in Australia for over 3,000 years, which makes them invasive. They were brought to Australia by boat by the ancestors of the Aborigines. So they came over 3,000 years ago. They crossed into Australia, and then they either escaped and became wild, and have threatened the native wildlife and livestock. Now, because they have changed so much over those 3,000 years, they are their own subspecies of canine, and they are the only canine in Australia, which makes them the number one predator in that country. However, because their numbers are getting higher and higher, they're eating a lot of these smaller native populations. Hence, that's why they're considered an invasive species. Now, with the dingo, the best thing that they can do is to essentially hunt, poison, and something that is known as barrier fencing. They have actually built fences to keep them from going into other parts of Australia. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you an image of that. So down below, or in the picture on the left, is a map kind of showing us where that border fence lies within Australia. So they're trying to keep these dingoes and other small animals from crossing into most of Australia. However, as you can see on the other map, it's not always successful, because you can see that the areas in yellow are where the dingo is found. The only area of Australia that doesn't seem to have any dingoes is this area right here. Alright, the next one we have is the camel. This animal was brought by the British during its colonization. If you recall, the reason why if you recall, Australia, especially the center, is very hot like in desert. So the British thought that they would make great animals to use not only as pack animals but for transportation, seeing as they are used to that type of environment. Now, over time, many of the camels were then released into the wild once modern transportation developed. So once you had trains, once you had vehicles, buses, trains, once those things developed, they ended up releasing these camels and just kind of leaving them to themselves. However, that created problems because now their numbers are exploding. There's nothing that can essentially kill a camel, and their numbers are getting out of control. The reason why they're considered invasive, unfortunately, they damage a lot of crops. Obviously, they're big animals, so they're not can only eat their humans' crops, but they can destroy them by stepping on them and things like that. And they can erode the soil of native plants. Now, there are a couple solutions here. You have sterilization, so once again, capturing them in the wild, taking them to a vet, making sure that they can't reproduce anymore, or they've even called about culling them, which is just a very fancy way of saying that they are humanely killing them to get them out of Australia. And this one's kind of controversial because there are a lot of animal activists that don't condone taking the life of any animal. This map down below, you have more or less where these camels can be found. This area here that I'm kind of tracing or outlining is more or less where a majority of Australia's deserts are found. So the camel fits is right at home in that type of environment. Alright, and the last one we have is the rabbit. Now, these animals may look cute and cuddly, but they have actually caused a lot of problems for Australia. They were originally brought in 1857 for food and to hunt. Once again, some European probably got bored or missed that he used to hunt in Europe, and he brought some rabbits and he let them loose in the wild. Unfortunately, these rabbits can reproduce super quickly, and they have spread throughout the entire country, and they are essentially eating all the crops, the grasses, and they're not leaving any for a lot of the native species. Now, some solutions very similar to the dingo. So you can hunt them, which is very popular. You have barrier fencing, and you also have poisoning. However, poisoning isn't the most successful because other animals can then be exposed to that poison, thus killing them. So poisoning hasn't proven to be the most effective. This first picture here shows us where they have a lot of those, where they've erected or built these barrier fences. As you can see, it's found in Western Australia. Each one of those lines is a barrier fence. Here you have more or less where the range of European rabbits are in Australia. As you can see, they have spread out through most of the continent. And then here is an example. Here is an example of a barrier fence. As you can see, the fence kind of curls up so that the rabbit or dingo can't dig underneath it. And these are just some of the solutions that seem to have worked out. Now, make sure we'll talk about this on Tuesday when we get back. Be sure to answer all the questions. Look some of these things up as you go through the video. Thank you.